Hello, my friend, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I am very excited to be talking about something that I actually wrote a piece for Brains magazine on this recently. And it's really about two very underappreciated tips for overcoming burnout that you very well might be skipping. I am totally guilty of this as well as a burnout coach, of focusing a little bit too much on the tangibles, your productivity systems, how much you're taking care of yourself, all of those kinds of things. And don't get me wrong, they are absolutely important. But I do think there are some mindset related things that no matter what you do in your systems, in your self-care, in your boundary setting even, that are going to really, really be game changing when it comes to overcoming burnout. These two things, without them, everything else is just a band-aid. And the burnout would ultimately come back. And nobody wants that, right? Nobody wants to overcome your stress just for it to come back in a month and a half. That's really not what this is about. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on today. The reason this came up is actually, I was doing a speaking engagement not too long ago. And at the very, very end of that speaking engagement, my client asked me, "Hey, Ellen, if you had to leave us with any kind of final little kernel of wisdom, what would it be?" And I'm a firm believer that burnout is incredibly, incredibly personal. Not only is burnout very holistic, from my opinion, like it's not just about your career, it's not just about your to-do list, but it's very, very personal. But I will totally acknowledge that it depends in that situation kind of felt like a cop-out. Even though that's immediately where my brain went, it depends didn't feel right. It didn't feel right to say, oh, well, it depends on XYZ factors. So I really thought about it for a second, and that's kind of what informed today. If there's anything that I think is kind of the final, most important piece when it comes to overcoming burnout, it's this. You have to have self-awareness, and you have to have compassion. Maybe not where you thought I was going to go with this, right? But ultimately, that is perhaps one of the most important things, two of the most important things that you can have when it comes to overcoming your burnout. Let me break this down a little bit to tell you what I mean. Let's start with the self-awareness component. For most of us, when it comes to our lives and kind of how we approach things in our lives, we are pedal to the metal. We are moving at the speed of light through our tasks, through our responsibilities, even perhaps through our time at the end of the day. Maybe that's because of guilt. Maybe, we're trying to be present and be in our time with our loved ones and our family and our friends. And yet there's a sense of guilt there. So we're almost kind of trying to rush through it to get on to the next thing. So many of us, and I dated somebody who was like this too, we move so quickly through life that we do not have time to be self-aware. And that's a problem. We're flitting so quickly from one task to the next that we don't even have time to take inventory of what our stressors are. We go from back-to-back tasks at work to back-to-back meetings to back-to-back social commitments when we get home to back-to-back, responsibilities. If we're not folding laundry or washing dishes, we are checking our phones and checking our emails. And we never have the time or the pause in our life to really self-reflect. And that's when things start to fall through the cracks. Self-awareness is ultimately created by creating space in our lives. And I will totally acknowledge that I used to be the person who used to say, I don't like silence. I am still somebody who struggles with not constantly having noise in the background. Probably one of the few times that I'm in quiet is when I'm recording this. Is when I'm making this content for you, because I can't have noises in the background. And actually, I do still have noises in the background. I have fans running, you just can't hear them because of my microphones. But this is one of the few times in my life when I am actually in quiet. And this is something I've been intentionally working against, because I have realized that for me, I need to have that white space. I need to have that empty space in my life. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to catch on to some of these patterns. Because it's in this time where we have white space that we are able to start to reflect. I mean, seriously, ask yourself right now, when was the last time you did nothing? When was the last time you spent time in silence? When was the last time you didn't feel obligated to do or to produce? For so many of us, we may not even be able to answer that question. It's been so long that we don't even know when the last time was, right? All right, can't lose my voice. I've got speaking engagements this week. All right, so like I said, for so many of us, it's been so long since we've done this that we don't even actually know when the last time it was. But that's also not part of the difficulty with this. Another big difficulty people have is, what does it even look like when we sit down? Do you just expect me to, stare at a wall? I was actually asked that during a speaking engagement. Do you expect me to just sit in silence and stare at a wall? Sometimes, yes, I do, but I know how uncomfortable that can be for people. A lot of us don't like spending time in silence because we don't like where our mind goes when there's nothing to distract us. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some questions to ask yourself. Ask yourself, what things have you been really doing that are helping with your stress? And what things are you doing that are adding to your stress? Very, very simple questions. And you might find that when you first ask yourself these questions, you don't immediately come up with answers. That's okay. The idea here is to give yourself that space and see where your mind goes. Maybe your mind doesn't go to work. Maybe it goes to social commitments. Maybe it goes to expectations that your family has for you or your friends. Just see where your mind goes. And I'm not saying that the first time you do this, those are the things. What I actually would highly recommend doing is you want to make this a pattern. You want to sit down maybe once right now and ask yourself these questions, and now do it again next week and then the week after. And what we're doing is we want to start looking for patterns. I actually do this in the context of doing what I call a weekly review. And if that's something you want me to dive further into, let me know. It's one of my favorite tools, and I would love to dive deeper into how I do this. I can show you how I do it on my iPad, inside of my Notion, all the things. But that's the idea behind this. Ask yourself 2 very, very simple, straightforward questions and ask it over several weeks and just see what are the patterns that come up. Do you say the same things that are helping and that are hurting you when it comes to stress week to week to week to week? And if you do, that's the things that we need to start changing. So that's step 1. That's the first really underappreciated thing that we can do for overcoming burnout. But if that's step 1, if self-awareness is step 1, compassion is probably step 2. Compassion has been a hot topic when it comes to the speaking engagements I've been doing lately. Everybody wants to talk about compassion. And when it comes to compassion, I made a bold statement in one of my speaking engagements where I said, burnout cannot be overcome without compassion. And the more that I think about this, the more I stand by it. Because ultimately, if we're not being compassionate, there's 2 effects of this. If we're not being compassionate toward others, we are going to not receive the social support that we need to overcome our burnout. There is probably one of the most studied aspects of burnout and self-care comes down to social support and the necessity of having social support to overcome burnout. Now, whether or not that is social support outside of your work or really having psychological safety in your team, with your manager, feeling like it is safe to talk to your leaders about the things that you are experiencing, that's really what social support and psychological safety looks like. And it is one of the most important things for us when it comes to recovering from burnout. We do not recover from burnout in a vacuum. We need to know that we're not alone. We need to know that there are people that will take care of us. That's really, really important. And if we are not giving compassion to others, we're not going to receive it back from them. So that's kind of the first side of compassion. But perhaps the hardest thing when it comes to compassion for people is having compassion for ourselves. I would say the vast majority of the time, unless you're a sociopath, giving compassion to others is relatively easy for us, especially the people that we see consistently on a day-to-day basis or, the loved ones in our lives. Having that compassion is relatively easy. But having compassion for ourselves, not so much, right? We shit talk ourselves to no end. That saying of we are our own worst critics, it's so freaking true. And so that's really where the burnout cannot be overcome without compassion comes in. Yes, we need social support, but more so than anything, we need the ability to be honest with ourselves and not judge ourselves. If you look at your to-do list and your schedule, the thing that is maybe freaking you out and really, really overwhelming you and causing stress in your life, if you look at that and be like, come on, man up, you should be able to handle this. If you look at that and you're like, wow, if you really can't do this, you are not cut out for this. Think of some of the things that you say to yourself. I'm actually probably watering down some of the stuff that we say to ourselves, right? We probably drop some serious self-critique and self-judgment on ourselves day in and day out. And you know what? I'm just going to go there. We're marking this as not, not something for kids to watch. We might say, I'm such a fuck up. Or, wow, I did such a shitty job. I'm not meant to be a manager. I'm such a failure. Like, why would anybody ever love me? I'm going there because we say stuff like that to ourselves, right? And when it comes to stress and burnout, comes to mental health, those are some of the worst things we can do. Self-compassion is one of the most important things that we can have when it comes to our mental health and when it comes to overcoming stress and overcoming burnout. Because if we don't have self-compassion, if we are not able to look at the thing that's causing stress in our lives and acknowledge that it's hard, acknowledge that other people might not be struggling with this, but that's okay because they're struggling with something else. If we're not able to look at that and have some mindfulness of the fact that just because we're struggling with that thing doesn't mean we're a failure, doesn't mean we're the shittiest manager ever, that's the most important thing. Self-compassion has 3 components: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. This is from work by Dr. Kristen Neff. If you haven't read her work, she's got a book that's called Self-Compassion, which I highly recommend. If you haven't read her work, it's powerful, powerful stuff to just contrast the way in which we often talk about ourselves versus the way in which we need to. We need to have self-kindness. We can't shit talk ourselves. We need to have common humanity and recognize that just because it feels like we're the only person who's struggling with this doesn't mean we are. And we have to have mindfulness. Mindfulness in this context is about recognizing what you're feeling, but not over-identifying with it. Recognizing that this might make you feel like a failure, but not taking that and being, okay, that must mean I am a failure. Because those are 2 very different things. Feeling like a failure and actually being a failure, 2 very, very different things. But when we are in the thick of, this kind of self-critique, when we are in the thick of that shitty self-talk, we don't differentiate the 2. So self-compassion is about bringing that mindfulness back into it and recognizing, okay, just because I feel like a failure doesn't mean I am one. It's also, a lot of this can be, the work of Dr. Brené Brown. Brené Brown is one of my heroes. I'm obsessed with her. I've read every book she's ever written, watched probably every talk she's ever given. I love her. But one of the big things she says is differentiating our language to be blaming versus shaming. Shame is, I am a mistake. And blame is, that was a mistake. It's assigning negativity to the action and not to us as people. And switching from shaming language into blaming language can be a good way to start having self-compassion. Another way to start having self-compassion is to kind of think of that fix versus growth mindset. I work in my day job in the education industry, and this is something we talk about a lot. So if you hear a lot about fixed and growth mindset and you're rolling your eyes right now, I understand. I really do. This is something, though, that is really important with our language, because a lot of times we look at that and we're like, oh my God, I just can't hack it. I just can't do this. I'm not going to be successful. I'm failing. And growth mindset is about recognizing that you might feel like that now, but that doesn't mean that's going to be your state and like how you're going to feel into the future. You might say, I'm failing. Maybe like if we're using a legitimate academic context, maybe you did just fail a test. Maybe you did. Maybe you did just fail a performance review. Maybe you did. So right now, you might feel like you're failing. You might be failing. But growth mindset is about recognizing that that doesn't mean that you'll be failing in the future. Just because you failed now doesn't mean you might fail later. Just because your business is struggling now doesn't mean that it's going to struggle for the foreseeable future. Growth mindset is about recognizing the fact that where you are right now doesn't have to be where you're always going to be, because we can grow. We can improve. So embracing that distinction, embracing that yet language. I am not successful yet. I might be failing right now, but I can improve in the future. It's distinguishing between where you are now versus where you want to go, and really embracing the fact that you don't have to stay where you are right now. There's nothing that says that. So embracing that yet language can be another really important part of self-compassion. So those are the 2 underappreciated burnout tips that I want to leave you with today. Self-awareness, so that you can start to pinpoint the patterns, the mindsets, the things that are really overwhelming you. That is where self-awareness is going to come. Self-compassion is going to help us stop beating ourselves up. Because if we beat ourselves up, we're not going to want to change. If we're beating ourselves up, we're not going to have the motivation to improve. Self-compassion is about recognizing and not forcing yourself to have that 9 p.m. cup of coffee and keep hustling in your day when all you want to do is curl up with your significant other on the couch and watch Schitt's Creek. That's self-compassion. It's recognizing what you need, having compassion for it, and recognizing that you need to give that thing to yourself, that it makes you no less of a successful person to do that. That's where self-compassion comes in. So if self-awareness is step 1, compassion is step 2. And we need both if we're going to overcome from burnout. We need to be able to identify what our stressors and do it in real time. And we need to have the compassion with ourselves to be able to give ourselves the things that we need. That's ultimately what it boils down to. Well, some technical issues cut off the end of my audio, but that's all for today. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you're liking what you're hearing. Comment with your favorite tip or what you'd like to see more of, and I will see you next time.